This lecture, together with the previous lecture on philosophical naturalism, dealing with it from a scientific perspective, are the closest in this course that you'll get to anything resembling apologetics. I do teach an apologetics course, but these are places where there is something defense-oriented about our consideration of philosophy. So just to review a little bit from last week's class before we move forward into Chapter 13. In Chapter 12, just wrapping up, looking at the Arthur Holmes from Wheaton University quote on the bottom of page 283, he says, according to Thomas Reid, so Thomas Reid was probably the preeminent Scottish common sense realist. The common sense realism was a reaction against skepticism, especially an empirical form of skepticism, such as we find with David Hume. And so this is the primarily the 18th and then also into the 19th century that we deal with this phenomenon. And Reid is the leading amongst them as far as amongst those who are representative of this. I can say some other names to you. But according to Thomas Reid, God so constituted the mind that we believe without proof that, for instance, external objects exist. I don't have to have somebody prove it to me. It's right there. I'd reach out my hand and grab it. We believe that memory tells of a past. That I'm not like, if you're familiar with the movie Blade Runner, that we aren't humanoids who've had memories that aren't really our own implanted in us to give us the idea that we had a past that really we didn't. We believe that memory is really memory of my past. We believe the causal principle, the idea that things have to be caused by something. There's no free lunch. You don't get something from nothing. And the axioms of geometry, basic axioms. We believe there's a distinction between right and wrong. We really do. And that God exists. These beliefs, which we know so surely to be true, are, according to Reid, spontaneous interpretations of experience rather than logical inferences. We don't think through our response to these realities in our lives. We just spontaneously respond to them. We don't have to be this logical process of saying this, therefore that. The appearance of a sign is followed by belief in the thing signified. A sensation by belief in its present existence. I really am cold, or that really was hot, or that really does taste spicy. A remembrance by belief in its past existence. That really did happen, that's why I remember it. And imagination isn't accompanied by beliefs at all. So we don't think that I have to have some sort of a belief in order to imagine something. We think that we can imagine something because we have that as a capacity. We have the ability to dream up fantasical sorts of things and imaginary sorts of things. This is all due to the way that human beings are put together. It's a matter of common sense, not reason, and it's common to all human beings. Our very nature evokes universal beliefs and bears witness to their truth. And I think that's most people would agree with what Thomas Reid's perspective is that Holmes is speaking of there. So now let's look at Stephen Wikstra's comment on the bottom of page 284. He says, our creaturely epistemic, that means belief-forming condition, is that we must trust the basic belief-forming mechanisms with which we are endowed, presuming their reliability until we have reasons for revising them. So ordinarily we trust our senses and we trust the information they're giving us. Now maybe I had a fever, and because I had a fever I was delirious and I saw things or I imagined things that weren't true. Or perhaps I was on a mind-altering substance. Sometimes you don't have to be using an illegal substance for that to happen. You could be put on some sort of a medication that has an effect on you that you have a reaction against. And so we might upon reflection realize that, well, I didn't perceive things accurately. But normally, the normal human condition is that we believe what our mind perceives unless we have reason not to. That seems reasonable, really, whether or not you're a believer. So this is Plantinga, I believe, right? Yes, it's Plantinga. God has endowed us in such a way that we have a strong tendency or inclination toward belief in God. And that tendency has been in part overlaid or suppressed by sin. Okay, that's biblical teaching. That's Romans 1. Were it not for the existence of sin in the world, human beings would believe in God to the same degree and with the same natural spontaneity that we believe in the existence of other persons, an external world or the past. This is the natural human condition. It's because of our presently unnatural sinful condition that many of us find belief in God difficult or absurd. The way Romans 1 puts it is that we suppress the truth in unrighteousness, that which is inside of us. The fact is, Calvin thinks, one who does not believe in God is in an epistemically substandard position, rather like a man who does not believe his wife exists, or thinks she's like a cleverly constructed robot and has no thoughts, feelings, or consciousness. And so Nash observes on the bottom of page 286, right after that, a number of thinkers like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud argued that the reason that some people believe in God is because their cognitive equipment is malfunctioning. Now, the truth is, given the fact that the majority of human beings have across time believed in God, what these folks really think, or if you're one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, what you think is that you're not like one of the sheep. You're not one of the herd of humanity that think these things. You're so smart that you've risen above and figured out that there isn't a God. And so that's really what's going on. And if Plantinga is right about the epistemic condition of the one who's thinking that way, it's the cognitive equipment of the atheists like Marx and Freud and Dennett and Harris and Dawkins that is malfunctioning. And Nash goes on to say, this is still dependent upon some of the things said by Calvin and cited by Plantinga, since humans have the sensus divinitatis, this sense of the divine, consideration of a theistic argument may present them with information or lead them to experiences that, in conjunction with their God-implanted dispositions, if you remember the nisus from last chapter, will trigger belief in God in ways similar to how non-religious experiences or other justifying conditions trigger such beliefs as, I'm now seeing a tree, or I'm now drinking a cup of coffee, that kind of thing. That it'll be just as natural as that. Essentially, the takeaway from all of this is the realization that it's possible to have warranted belief that God exists, even if we're not aware of or adept at using good arguments which establish his existence. In other words, as over against Richard Dawkins and those like him, belief in God is not a sign of ignorance or stupidity, and you don't need to feel like you're on the back foot when you're dealing with somebody who's mocking it or who's contemptuous of it. So it means if you're being derided for your beliefs by someone who's contemptuous of faith and who claims to speak from a scientific or philosophical perspective, you don't have to feel like you're in a substandard place. You can reply, my beliefs are properly basic, and you can offer to demonstrate to them why that is the case. So with that, we get into chapter 13, which is addressing the existence of God. And this is Nash, right in the beginning here. In the last chapter, he said, I explained that proofs for God's existence are not necessary for belief in God to be rational. But I went on to say that this does not mean that arguments for God's existence are useless. It's one thing to need an argument, and something quite different to have an argument. The case that chapter 12, the previous chapter, presents for the proper basicality of belief in God does not negate the usefulness of good arguments. We don't say, well, it's just properly basic, so I'm not going to defend it. After all, Reformed epistemology acknowledges that all kinds of things can function as triggering conditions that, in conjunction with our belief-forming dispositions, can produce immediately and non-inferentially the belief that God exists. So God might use some of your arguments, some of the things that you'd have to say, and I've seen this happen with very simple things. A man on the radio who was not a religious broadcaster at all, speaking about how did we come to have the solar system we have, and how did we come to be the kind of the Goldilocks planet that gets everything right, so that we're able to have life on this planet. And he was comparing the temperatures on Mercury and the temperatures on Mars, and the huge gravity on a big planet like Jupiter or Neptune. He's comparing that to the Earth and talking about the function of our moon. And this man, who was a fellow who I just coached sports together with him, he came to see me and he said that he suddenly realized there had to be a God for all of these things to come together. And that's the kind of thing that can happen, is just as you begin to realize how fine-tuned everything, you can have it be that, or whatever it might be that leads you in that direction, you can come to believe that God is there. Even though belief in God's existence does not require arguments or proofs, Nash goes on to say, it would be wrong to assume that good arguments cannot be found or that they're useless. For one thing, many people fail to understand that belief in God is, in fact, properly basic, and therefore they still feel compelled to seek proofs. So they want some evidence. They don't want to, they're from Missouri. They're kind of show me sort of folks. Thomas the Apostle is that kind of a person. I'm not going to believe unless I see. Now, what we're going to deal with in this chapter is the idea that this is not indubitable certainty that we have when it comes to the justifications or the evidences for belief. It's not that it's been proven beyond a doubt. And so I'm quoting from Aristotle because I use this quote when I'm dealing with the nature of ethics in my courses on ethics, but it's something that applies in this direction as well. He says, and he's written, remember, in all areas, Aristotle has, he says, for it's the mark of an educated man, ladies, that means you too, to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. So I don't want probable reasoning when I'm dealing with geometry or trigonometry. I want absolute correct numbers. We know exactly what it should be. But if I'm dealing with rhetoric, or if I'm dealing with something that is a more general and it's a more complex sort of a thing, not just something where we can have a formula to arrive at solving the unknown factor, well then I'm going to be dealing in the different nature of information or of evidence for the thing. So I just want to put these two books before you. The one on the right is the one I'm suggesting. The one on the left is the big version, and the one on the right is the Reader's Digest condensed version of the one on the left. This is Leslie Newbigin, who was a missionary in India and then came home to the United States. He was quite a good theologian as well. And this is his little book. He deals a lot with apologetics. His book, Proper Confidence, Faith, Doubt, and Certainty in Christian Discipleship. And in this book, he deals especially with the concept of that we need to understand that the sort of certainty that we especially associate with Descartes is not the kind of, with René Descartes, is not the kind of certainty that we're going to have in the field of faith. I couldn't more highly recommend any book to help you with that than that little slender volume on the right. I mean, it's maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, and it will tremendously help you to understand why that's the case. So this is Professor Rembe Edwards. He just died this last September, and he's was a wonderful man. He says, occasionally perhaps even some of the traditional proofs for the existence of God have been interpreted as providing conclusive evidence for their theistic conclusions. From the outset, however, we must recognize that it is a mistake so to regard them, not because we know before we even begin that they do not prove anything, but rather because we know that there are no philosophical beliefs anywhere that are supported by conclusive evidence. Now, Dr. Nash disagrees with that, if you pay attention to the footnote, but he's still quoting Edwards because overall the quote is good. To expect indubitable premises and rigorous deductive validity from the traditional proofs for God's existence is to expect too much. Amen, I agree. No philosophical proofs of anything rest on indubitable premises. Philosophical proofs simply cannot meet such exacting requirements, but this is not to make lame excuses for sloppy thinking. And so where Rem Edwards is going with this is the idea of a cumulative case, sort of an argument for the existence of God. Now, remember that the Bible doesn't ever set out to prove God. The Bible takes God as existing right from the beginning. It begins, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim. In the beginning, God created the heavens, the haaretz, and the earth. So it's that God is taken as being there. He's just there as far as the way the scriptures deal with him. It's not going to try to defend his existence. But there are some people who aren't in a place where they're receptive to that. So, Stephen Evans on page 290 says we ought to strive to make a judgment which is in accordance with the preponderance of evidence and which seems highly probable or plausible. So, showing a person the evidence for the existence of God. That means that you need to be familiar with the evidence for the existence of God. As Evans notes, good evidence for religious faith will not be some kind of absolute proof that some philosophers seem to seek. Rather, it will be evidence which is sufficient to satisfy a reasonable person. That doesn't mean it will persuade them, but it will tell them that your faith isn't based on nothing. It will tell them that you're not a fideist. You don't just say, well, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, but rather you have some good justification for believing what you believe. As the question is posed by Evans on page 291, must an argument be universally accepted to be a proof, accepted by all sane people who consider it? Frequently, something like this standard seems to be presupposed in these discussions. Such a concept of proof seems impossibly high. It also seems unfair, since this is not the standard of proof we require for non-religious areas, for all kinds of areas, by the way. It's giving too high of a standard and one that really doesn't work in the real world. So what we're getting into here, and especially Richard Swinburne, the Oxford theologian and philosopher, is going to come into the equation. I've had opportunity to hear Swinburne both at Oxford at the University Church of St. Mary's and then at the Round Church, which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Cambridge. He's not the most scintillating speaker, to tell the truth. He's a great author, but he's a famous defender of the faith. And so this is much of what we'll see here is coming from Swinburne. And so he argues for the idea of cumulative arguments, arguments where there's a lot of evidence piling up, assessing all of the evidence. The case for God's existence should be cumulative. There's nothing wrong with reaching a decision based on a cumulative argument. Nash says, as Evans states, one bit of evidence against a criminal may not be enough to convict him. The same may be said of a second or a third bit, or any number of bits when taken in isolation. If each bit does have some force, however, then all of the bits taken together may be more than enough to convict the accused and send him off to prison. And so Evan notes, the case for religious faith will not be based on a single argument functioning as a proof, but upon the total evidence available from every region of human experiences. Now, going back to Rem Edwards, he uses the differing fibers that make up the strength of a rope as an analogy for this sort of cumulative case argumentation. So that as we take argument after argument, evidence after evidence, it becomes strong like a rope. And here he's citing Edwards again, Nash is citing him, assessing the strength of the case for God's existence, like giving a judgment in a courtroom, is not like running a mathematical proof through a computer. Many complex arguments enter into the case for belief in God. As in a courtroom verdict, the verdict for or against the existence of God cannot be rendered in some purely automatic fashion. Finally, when all is said and done, someone must simply pass judgment. They have to kind of take and put them in the scales, the arguments in the scales, and see which side of the scale is weighed down more heavily, the one for or against the existence of God. And so this brings us to the type of reasoning we're using. Are we using deductive argumentation, like syllogisms, like Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, or are we using inductive argumentation, like what we use in the sciences? So philosophically, if we're trying to form an argument, usually we're using deductive reasoning to form an argument for a particular point. But when we're arguing for the existence of God, we're doing something different. Inductive reasoning reasons from particulars, from singular things to universals, versus deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning reasons from universals to particulars. The category of human, Socrates is a man, meaning he's a human being, and then from and all men are more mortal. Those are universals. Socrates is a man. That's a universal. All men are mortal. That's true of all men. That's a human. That's just a particular reality. And so then we reason to the particular regarding the singular man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's deductive reasoning. But that's not how induction works. Induction is the way that we reason in the sciences typically and in the social sciences. And the way it works is I set out, I was originally doing my dissertation in a direction that was more sociological, and I was told I needed to do a theoretical dissertation. But initially I was creating charts and doing statistics and all that sort of thing. And so how induction works is that you take and you go and you try to find all the information you can. And what you start with is you start with a thesis. You start with a claim. I'm claiming X. And so what I have to do is I have to go and make observations that have to do with my particular thing that I'm making a claim about. And all those observations come together and they either prove or they falsify my thesis. An awful lot of theses that get written are begun to try to prove an idea, and the person who set out to prove it for their doctorate actually falsifies it, and they prove what you're doing is now you're helping with the process of elimination. You've proven that this often previously thought idea that might be true or might be accurate is actually false. And so that is actually a finding. You've eliminated one possible wrong road to go down. Okay, but induction works this way. We take all these cumulative observations and we either prove or we falsify our thesis. It is cumulative and it's probabilistic. And the way that this sort of thing works, by the way, is this stands until somebody comes up with a better answer to how things work. And so it's always up for peer review. I've said this to you already in these previous lectures. So Richard Swinburne especially addresses Christians and inductive argumentation when it comes to the existence of God. And he speaks about adding up all the indicators, the inductively strong arguments from the cumulative case. They form our discussion. So I'm on page 292 in your book, and he's talking about deduction or induction. And what Nash then speaks about, very last paragraph on the bottom of 292, he says, philosopher Anthony Flew, who was the most famous atheist of the second half of the 20th century, and who became a theist before he died, philosopher Anthony Flew, whose commitment to atheism is well known, criticizes philosophers who admit that certain arguments fail as deductive proofs, and who then attempts to utilize them as inductive proofs. He writes, it's occasionally suggested that some candidate proof, although admittedly failing as a proof, may sometimes do useful service as a pointer. This is a false exercise of the generosity so characteristic of examiners. A failed proof cannot serve as a pointer to anything, save perhaps to the weakness of those who accepted it. Nor for the same reason can it be put to work along with other throwouts as part of the accumulation of evidence. If one leaky bucket will not hold water, that's no reason to think that 10 can. But interestingly, what Swinburne does is he grabs right a hold of that illustration and he uses it against him. So here's what he says. Picture that you now have a leaky bucket like this, but you jam it down inside another bucket. And they're all leaky buckets. You've got like 10 leaky buckets, and you jam one inside another, inside another, inside another. He said if we jam them all together, in fact, they will hold water. He answers Flew by pointing out the arguments may be deductively weak, but they can be inductively strong. And this is his words. He says, this is on page 293, clearly if you jam 10 leaky buckets together in such a way that the holes in the bottom of each bucket are squashed close to solid parts of the bottoms of the neighboring buckets, you will get a container that holds water. I think that's interesting as far as the visual picture. The explanatory power of theism, says Nash, is based not on single isolated arguments, but on the cumulative case one gets by reflecting on the existence of the universe, the order of the universe, the facts of human rationality, moral consciousness, religious experience, and we can of course add a whole lot of other things to that list. So these are some of the typical arguments that we have for the existence of God. The cosmological arguments are arguments that basically said there has to, for there to be something, there has to be one who created something. There had to be a beginning. It didn't just come from nowhere. And so there's all different kinds. The most famous one today is the Kalam cosmological argument, and that's from a Muslim origin, but it's heavily used by Christian apologists. Teleological arguments are arguments from design. Things look like they're designed, like hearts look like pumps, and eyes look like scopes, and kidneys and livers look like filters, and so on. And so there's a claim that these things that are very purposeful, that there's somebody who has designed them with that purpose. And as I've said to you already, teleological language is largely in the life sciences. You can't escape it. And so teleological arguments, I think, are pretty compelling. The ontological argument is something that was dealt with in the chapter where we dealt with possible worlds. And there we got into Anselm of Canterbury. And the ontological argument is God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. And I'm just going to move on from there. So, argument from motion, and this is kind of the thought process that's there in Aristotle in order to have a prime mover. There's got to be somebody or something that set everything in motion. Argument from contingent beings to necessary beings. This is related to the cosmological argument that if there are contingent beings, beings that don't have the power of existence in themselves, there had to be a being who did have that power, what we would call the characteristic of aseity, a necessary being, or a person who has the power of being in and of themselves, as in when Moses says to the Lord, "Whom shall I tell them sent me?" My fellow Jews, when I go down to lead them out of Egypt, tell them I am that I am sent you. Then there's argument from degrees of perfection to a perfect being. We have a concept of perfection, and we know that we fall short of it, so that there must be a perfect being from whom we get this concept. And there's other sorts of arguments too, but those are some of them that can be added up. So this is the way Swinburne tries to communicate it in terms of a courtroom. That Smith has blood on his hands hardly makes it probable that Smith murdered Mrs. Jones, nor by itself does that fact that Smith stood to gain from Mrs. Jones' death, nor by itself does the fact that Smith was near the scene of the murder at the time of it being committed. But all of these phenomena taken together, perhaps with other phenomena as well, may indeed make the conclusion probable. So then Swinburne talks about scientific explanations versus personal explanations. He's saying sometimes when we're dealing with the existence of God, a scientific explanation may be unsatisfying, but a personal explanation may fit. In scientific explanation, the effect is inferred from accompanying causes, conditions, and the relevant laws. The model or the paradigm of a scientific explanation is the way various phenomena are explained in physics. A personal explanation, in contrast, is one where the phenomena are explained in terms of a rational agent's intentional action. And much, not just in the world of philosophy, but even in the sciences today, is being spoken of that way, as you will see a little bit here. In a typical theistic argument, the theist draws attention to certain phenomena of either the outer world or the inner world. That was our very first chapter, dealing with worldview, that need explanation. Suppose we find that a scientific, that is, a non-personal explanation, fails to do justice to the phenomena. If we have only two choices, if an explanation must be either scientific or personal, and if we discover the phenomena like human rationality cannot adequately be explained in terms of impersonal causes and conditions, it's natural to conclude that we must then seek for an explanation in terms of the intentional action of some rational agent. There's somebody behind this. There's agency behind this. According to Swinburne, again Richard Swinburne, it's helpful to draw the contrast between natural and intelligent causes. So there's a difference between something just being the consequences of natural processes and something being that there's a agency or an intelligence guiding what happens. This means that we're sometimes putting forth intentional causation by an intelligent agent as our proposed best explanation for the phenomena which we seek to explain. Nash says it this way. He says, when major features of the inner and outer worlds cannot be given an adequate scientific explanation, we'll have to give added weight to any personal explanation that does explain them. Should we ever become convinced that important features of reality require explanations in terms of the intentional actions of a rational being, we will have discovered significant support for belief in the existence of God. And as we're going to see, the cosmological or the anthropic cosmological principle seems to have those kind of characteristics. We'll get to that in a bit here. So let's just take a pause from that to consider the response of the unbelieving naturalistic mind to these kinds of explanations. One of the primary objections to such explanations is saying to the believer, when you say that this kind of thing is a sign of agency, well, you're just using the concept of the God of the gaps. And we want to be careful not to use just a God of the gaps kind of a thing. So whenever, early on, when Darwinism was in its infancy, whenever there would be some sort of a hurdle that didn't seem like it could be crossed by evolutionary type of thinking, we would say, well, that's God. You know, Darwin said that he was afraid of the eye. The eye was too complex, and so he didn't see how the eye could evolve. And to which the response of believers was, "Well, that's demonstrates God." Things like the neck of the giraffe and other things of that sort. How could you have a transitional form? The neck of a giraffe couldn't slowly get longer. It has to be able to reach these leaves that are way up high on the tree. It has to be long to start with, and so, well, that was God. Well, the problem with just invoking a God of the gaps kind of an answer, this is God, as kind of our gloss for the problems that one has with naturalistic explanations, is as science goes forward, if those things are then able to be explained, and you've staked everything on that kind of argumentation, your God is living more and more in a very small amount of room that's left. And so this is biologos, this argumentation. If you're not familiar, biologos are they're theistic evolution folks. I'm not a biologos proponent at all, but they have this to say, and I think this is helpful with regard to the God of the gaps sort of thought. Every field of science has unanswered questions and gaps in our understanding. Scientists typically view these as open research questions. Others sometimes argue that if science can't explain how something happened, then God must be the explanation, as I was just saying. Such arguments are called God of the gaps arguments. Now, here's the caution they're giving. The risk in these arguments is that science is always developing. If gaps in scientific knowledge are the basis for belief in God, which hopefully they're not, then as scientists fill in the gaps, the evidence for God disappears. The God of the Bible, however, is much more than a God of the gaps. Amen. Christians believe that God is always at work in the natural world, in the gaps as well as in the areas that science can explain. And so the scientific lens doesn't have a place for providence. It doesn't have a place that in Him we live and move and have our being, and that He holds all things together. Colossians 1, the Colossian hymn that says that in Christ Him all things hold together. But that's our understanding. This isn't just, Psalm 104 has this wonderful picture of all of creation being dependent upon God, and He's taking care of it, that God does care for and provide in His creation. But the natural mind that is approaching things without any recourse to God gives merely naturalistic explanations. So the Christian thinks that those naturalistic explanations are missing a dimension already. Okay, back to Nash's flow of thought. He says the procedure adopted in this chapter is to draw attention to some phenomenon or state of affairs that requires an explanation. The second step is to ask what conditions or set of conditions best explains this feature of the inner or the outer world. How might a naturalist, this means philosophical naturalist, account for this phenomenon? Is a naturalistic explanation adequate? Is a scientific, that is a non-personal explanation, adequate, or is a personal explanation better? Does an adequate personal explanation provide clues that point in the direction of God? He explains that the strategy is to expose a person with whom we're sharing to the evidence of design in his or her world with the hope that the sensus divinitatis will kick in, and they'll feel the weight of the support for God's existence implied by these aspects of the natural world. This is, as has been previously pointed out, not a matter of deductive evidence, but of inductive indicators, like a lawyer building a case in the courtroom for a conclusion. The last step of this process is to ask this person if such design and purposiveness makes sense in a worldview without God. It does seem strange that we would get a Goldilocks universe, right? That everything just comes together just right. So this is the argument from truth. Nash brings up next Kant's rational categories that make up what he's called the sausage machine. That means, remember, the mind processing what it sees. Kant says essentially that it's not, remember the correspondence theory of truth. If we say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, then we speak truth. But if we say of what is not that it is, or of what is that it is not, then we don't speak truth. And so the idea historically had been that it's the mind's business to conform itself to reality. But Nash had this Copernican revolution in epistemology, where he says it's not the mind's business to conform itself to reality. It's reality's business to conform itself to the mind. And so he had that we take in through our senses information, sense datum, qualia, from the world around us, and then out comes our knowledge. And so Nash proposes agreeing to Kant's claims with a particular goal in mind. If in fact all human beings do possess the same rational categories, how do we explain this remarkable state of affairs? How come my brain processes things just the same way that yours does? Nash believes that the preformation theory offers a satisfying explanation for the data, and we've already dealt with the preformation theory in previous lectures. I'm not going to reiterate that. So, knowledge is possible only because God has endowed humans with certain innate ideas along with dispositions or attitudes to think in certain ways. This is just a summing up of it. These forms of thought correspond to the real world, which is also a creation of God. So basically innate information in our minds. This is dealing with Gordon Clark and what Clark has to say as far as the existence of truth. Let me turn to that page because we're getting near the end of this chapter. And it is interesting what Clark has to say. So this is page 297. Clark goes through these. This is the argument from the existence of truth. He says truth exists. He establishes this point by reminding us of the self-defeating nature of any attempt to deny the existence of truth. If I try to deny that truth exists, I want you to believe that it's true, that I'm claiming that it doesn't exist. Truth is immutable. It's impossible for truth to change. As Clark says, truth must be unchangeable. What is true today has always and always will be true. For Clark, all true propositions are eternal and immutable truths. And so if truth changes, then, if truth changes, then it's not truth, right? Truth is eternal. It would be self-contradictory to deny the eternality of truth. If the world will never cease to exist, it's true that the world will never cease to exist. If the world will someday perish, then that's true. But truth itself will abide, even though every created thing should perish. If suppose someone asks, what if truth should perish? But suppose someone asks, what if truth should perish? Then it would still be true that truth had perished. Any denial of the eternality of truth turns into an affirmation of its eternality, of its eternity. Truth is mental. The existence of truth presupposes the existence of minds. Without a mind, truth could not exist. The object of knowledge is a proposition, a meaning, a significance. It is thought. And so we can go on here. So he's saying truth is superior to the human mind. He's going through these arguments. I'm not going to unpack them too much here. By this, Clark means that by its nature, truth cannot be both subjective and individualistic. Humans know certain truths that are not only necessary but also universal. While these truths are immutable, the human mind is changeable. Even though beliefs vary from one person to another, truth itself cannot change, and so on. So he's saying, as we look at truth, the reality of truth, there is a truth, and of course we deal with one who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that God is the basis of truth, that this is something that we encounter this understanding of truth in our minds. We already know that there is such a thing as truth. This is also an indicator, an argument for the existence of God. And so truth ultimately is God. Now what Nash starts dealing with after he gets done with that is he goes to recent advances in science. He says, bottom of page 298, I move now to a discussion of recent scientific discoveries that seem to offer support for belief in God. Two lines of argument that arise out of these discoveries end up as highly advanced and sophisticated versions of the design argument, the teleological argument. The reason this information was not available until recently was the development of technology that provided information about living cells and information about DNA's genetic code. Those two things. And so he gets into, as he deals with this, two kinds of order. And the kinds of order that he deals with, I don't know if you're familiar with this. I live in Maine. And this is the outline of a face that appeared on the side of a mountain in New Hampshire for many years. He was called the Old Man of the Mountain. And so this is Daniel Webster speaking about this, a quote from Daniel Webster. Men hang out their signs indicative of their respective trades. Shoemakers hang out a gigantic shoe, jewelers a monster watch, and a dentist hangs out a gold tooth. But up in the mountains of New Hampshire, God Almighty has hung out a sign to show that there he makes men. And so the problem is, as we look at it, is you look to the left, that old picture of the old man of the mountain on the left, that's when they were dealing with trying to repair the nose because it was starting to shift. Well, eventually this stuff all falls away, and this was just a natural occurrence. This was something that, I mean, sometimes a mountain will look like a bison, sometimes a mountain will look like a camel, and so mountains have names, some of them, for the things that they appear like. They vaguely look like a certain shape, but that's a lot different than this. Okay? And so when we see this kind of order, when we see order that's not just natural, but that it's intentional and that there's an intelligence behind it. Remember back to the chapter where we dealt with you're coming into Wales, and on the side of a hill you see spelled out with white rocks, welcome to the, and it gives you the name of this town, that we don't think that those rocks just happen to be there. So if I see a mountain that looks like this, I know that there was an intelligence that purposely did this. And this is the Robert E. Lee Memorial that we have down in Lookout Mountain in Georgia. And the largest of these, so this one back here, that's Gutzlem Borglum, who began this process and finished for us Mount Rushmore. And there is now a Polish architect who's been at it for quite a while, or not architect, sculptor rather. And so the picture you see down on the left here with Crazy Horse is where they're ultimately going. And the picture on the right is what the face looks like. They got the face and they have the hand already. And so that arrow is to point to where the face actually is. And there's a lot of work going on the hand these days. But when we see this kind of thing, we can see that there's an intelligence behind it. There's purposely an intelligence that has designed what we're dealing with. And what we're finding, Dr. Nash is dealing with intelligent design towards the end of the chapter. And he's dealing with DNA. What we're especially finding, and what gave rise to the idea of intelligent design, was the anthropic cosmological principle. I have a BBC, I have a DVD of the BBC scientific documentary, The Anthropic Principle. And some of the greatest scientific minds of our day do in fact there describe the findings of cosmology. Dennis Scania, the head of the Cambridge University Observatory, says, so there's like 55 different variables that if we change them just a little bit in regard to the universe, we don't get the universe that we have. He says if you change a little bit the laws of nature, or you change a little bit the constants of nature, like the charge on the electron, the way the universe develops is so changed that it's very likely that intelligent life would not have been able to develop. David Deutsch of the Institute of Mathematics at Oxford University, if we nudge one of these constants just a few percent in one direction, stars burn out within 1 million years after their formation. There's no time for evolution, and you don't get, by the way, the formation of carbon, which is what you need for life. If we nudge it a few percent in the other direction, then no elements heavier than helium form. No carbon, no life. Not even any chemistry, no complexity at all. So David Deutsch and Brandon Carter is the originator of this idea in 1974. But David Deutsch and Frank Tipler of Tulane University in the United States, they took Brandon Carter's what came to be called the weak anthropic principle, and they set forward what they claim to be the strong anthropic principle, that it appears like there's an intentionality strongly behind this formation of our universe. Paul Davies, who I've quoted to you before in the presentation on naturalism, he said, the really amazing thing is not that life on Earth is balanced on a knife edge, but the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge. It would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off even slightly. You see, Davies adds, even if you dismiss man, human beings, as a chance happening, the fact remains that the universe seems unreasonably suited to the existence of life, almost contrived, you might say a put-up job. And the number of cosmologists, astronomers, physicists who say that there looks like there's an intelligence behind this is just huge. It's huge. And so that's what gave rise to the intelligent design movement. There was a backlash against the intelligent design movement, and one of the answers to it was to come up with the idea of the multiverse, that was the way to try to explain how we came about to have the so-called Goldilocks universe that gives us the right conditions for life to arise. So this dilemma of the extremely narrow range of values for physical constants is allowed for the evolution of conscious creatures such as ourselves is called the anthropical principle, and here's its form. It's stated. The universe must have those properties, not does have, but must have, that's the strong anthropic principle, those properties which allow life to develop within it at some stage in its history. And what I would just put forward to you is if you were going to read something, I wouldn't bother with any of the older material that has to do with intelligent design. William Dembski is good, but if there's an author who's especially dealing with these issues and dealing with them very well today and actually being well received in the world of science, it's Stephen Meyer. And Meyer is he's everywhere. He's on talk shows. He's on podcasts. And I just reading from the beginning of his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. He had Darwin's Doubt and The Signature in the Cell were previous books of his that were New York Times bestsellers, and this one has just blown those away. And he says this is on page 7 of his prologue. He says, I thought during the last 5 or 10 minutes of a debate, it's a debate that he's having with, is it Hitchens? I'm trying to remember who it is here. Let me just go back here. He's debating one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism. I think it is Hitchens, who's now deceased. And he winds up getting a migraine, but he says the migraine turns out to be to his benefit. No, it's Lawrence Krauss, of Cornell. He's just debating the physicist Lawrence Krauss. And he says, during the last 5 or 10 minutes of the debate, as my symptoms started to dissipate, but only just, the moderator asked us to summarize our perspective on what science could tell us about what lies behind it all. I found myself briefly describing 3 scientific discoveries that I thought jointly supported theistic belief, what I call the return of the God hypothesis. That's the chapter of the book, or the title of the book. 1, evidence from cosmology suggesting that the material universe had a beginning. That's called the Big Bang. 2, evidence from physics showing that from the beginning the universe has been finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. That's the anthropic cosmological principle that gave rise to the idea of intelligent design. And 3, evidence from biology establishing that since the beginning, large amounts of new functional genetic information have arisen in our biosphere to make new forms of life possible, implying, as I had argued before, the activity of a designing intelligence. And that's especially a result of the Human Genome Project, but more than just that. So if I could recommend one book to you if you wanted to pursue this is the book I would recommend. That being said, nothing says we have to condone or agree with science-based views that we don't believe. However, do we have to stridently oppose them, or can we permit others to have different convictions in this regard? So like if I'm having a conversation with somebody who's not a believer, who's unchurched, who's outside of the faith, and he or she holds to views that are scientific views that I don't hold, do I have to defeat those, or is there a way for me to have a conversation with them about God without having to even engage those? I propose that it's the latter. What's the non-negotiable in this discussion? Well, the non-negotiable, if I'm trying to argue for the existence of God, is teleology or purpose, design, a designer behind everything. But Paul Little when I was a young man in Bible college years ago, Paul Little was an apologist who went around defending the faith on different college campuses. Sadly, he died in a car accident as a young man. But what he used was General Douglas MacArthur and how MacArthur engaged the Pacific arena of the Second World War, how he fought there and led his troops there in order to show how we should deal with this. So he talks about that MacArthur was the first person to understand the power of being able to fly over targets and not engage them. So those of you who are older will remember this more than my younger students. There were, for 40, 50 years, Japanese soldiers still out on islands in the Pacific that had not yet engaged in battle. They still were engaged, they thought, in fighting the Second World War. In the Philippines, there were still up in the hills Japanese soldiers who didn't seem to know that the Second World War was over for a long time. And so the reason is what MacArthur did was the Marines would hit the beach, and they would fight to the last man. The Japanese, every one of them would give their lives, and it was a horrible, bloody business. And what MacArthur realized is we don't have to engage them all. We can just fly over them. And so Paul Little said, why don't we do what MacArthur did there when we're having conversations about God? And so what he would do is this, and I'm going to suggest this to you. If he's having a conversation with somebody about things and he doesn't agree with them as far as scientifically, and they are Darwinian in their understanding, he would say to them, well, do you think that evolution is what God used in order to make the world and to make the universe and everything? And he said the majority of the time they would say yes. So he'd say, well, I don't want to talk to you about evolution. I want to talk to you about God. And he'd just fly right over their scientific arguments against faith and speak to them about the gospel and be able to have a gospel conversation. Because if they've acknowledged they believe in God and they just think that God got there by a different means than he did, then that's a very helpful thing to be able to allow you to have a conversation with them about the faith. And it's Christ who saves. It's not just our view. It's not views with regard to how origins came to be, how we came to be in existence. And with that, I will draw to a close.